Okay, I am at Napoleon Middle School with 7th graders. I have about 140 students in 6 periods, so 20 to 25 students each class. My project dealt with the 3rd mathematical practice standard, building or being able to express your reasoning and like produce viable arguments. So what I did was all the students got kind of a homework assignment. They do genius problems during class, so they'll get a problem and they're hard problems, so only a couple students each class will probably get the answer. So it was kind of like geared towards that, where they were doing these genius challenge problems, but they weren't as hard of problems. But they had this assignment. There were 7 questions. They had to choose 3. The 3 that they had to choose, they had to write out all their work that they used to solve it, and then they were supposed to provide like an explanation, like I know this works because. So if you've heard of like the farmer, wolf, goat, wolf or cabbage problem, you know that problem, like those kinds of problems. Some of them were logic, some were a little more mathematical, but they had these problems. They had to choose 3. So the purpose of the study was to kind of see if doing these problems outside of class and then presenting them in class, which is the second part of the study, if that helped them with their ability to critique the reasoning of others and produce viable arguments for their own reasoning. So after they did these problems, they turned them in. Then they didn't really have a set time, but each student had to go up in front of the class, put their paper on the dot cam, and explain one answer that they did. So they could show their work, show the whole class, all of that kind of stuff. And then I graded them on their solutions, their written solutions, and then also on their verbal presentations in front of the class. And it wasn't always about whether or not it was right, but like how well they could explain themselves. So even if it was wrong, if they gave a good explanation, and then if I said, well, that's not going to work, how could you do that? And if they could kind of, produce that answer after I challenged their solution, then I guess that got higher points. But what else? The data analysis that I did was going to be geared towards like their presentations versus the explanations that they did on their written assignment. So whether writing those explanations out kind of helped them with their arguments when they were presenting. The problem that I encountered was, I think about 2/3 of the students didn't provide those explanations. So I mean, like, it was explicitly in the directions. I told them that they needed to do it, but they didn't provide those explanations, which made that a little bit harder because they weren't giving me the written explanations. Like, I could hear their verbal explanations, but then I couldn't compare them because they obviously weren't there. So instead of kind of like just comparing that in general, I compared the group of students that didn't write the explanations and their averages with the students that did write the explanations. In general, like their grade, obviously the ones who wrote the explanations are probably going to have higher grades because they got more points for that, but a lot more with the presentation scores to see if them writing their explanation on the paper before they presented would help them with that explanation in class. And so I did find that there was an increase in their ability to do that. So that was, I was kind of expecting that after going through that, because if they've actually taken the time to work on that, it makes more sense when they're trying to explain it to other people. So my study ended up being kind of like looking at that instead of what I was normally going to look at, because they didn't provide those explanations in the first place. What else was I going to say? With the explanations, I think that's something I would want to look in more to. I did it specifically outside of class time, like the inquiry-based problems, to see if it would have an effect on their in-class kind of performance presentation. And I think that isolated instance was a lot harder to evaluate. If it would have been like a consistent thing where they did it every couple weeks or every month, or we did those things more, not that we didn't do those things in class, but if it was more focused on the in-class work, I think there would have been like better results with that. There's something else that I really wanted to say, but I can't remember what it is right now. So ask me questions and maybe I'll think of it. Megan.
Did you prime your students in any way to be able to like explain their logic, or did you just jump in?
I think my mentor teacher had kind of done that, and I've kind of done that. They haven't officially, I mean, maybe on homeworks here and there, had to describe, like explain their reasoning, but in most instances it's just like verbal. They'll give me an answer and I'll say, well, how do you know that? Or how did you get to that? And so they'll talk to me about it, but a lot of times they don't have to write about it. So I was definitely interested in that writing. I think this is what I was going to say. I think that was one of the big reasons that they didn't write about it, because they don't do that a lot. And so when you have to explain why it works, they were just like, oh, I don't know how to do that, and they just gave up right away. And so instead of persisting, which is another mathematical practice standard, instead of like you persisting and trying to actually figure out the answer or figure out how to do that, they just said, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't normally have to do that. That's too much work. So a lot of that is kind of like the atmosphere and the work in class that my mentor teacher had set up, and that I kind of followed and kind of tried to get them to explain, but not enough. So, anything else?
Did you have them talk with a partner at all before then? Did you like have them work in groups, or just they worked on it by themselves and then they got it?
Well, I don't know if they worked in groups outside of class, but it was strictly like outside class basis. But right before, I kind of split them into groups before they presented, just so that I could make sure there wasn't 18 people trying to present the same problem. And they had a couple minutes just to like compare answers. So some of them would get in a group, realize they had the wrong answer, and then they would get up there and say, oh, my answer's completely wrong. And I said, okay, well then why is it wrong? So instead of them explaining to me their answer, explain to me why your answer's wrong. So that was kind of interesting to look at too. That after talking to their peers, they were able to do that in most cases. Anything else? Jen, you have a question? Call you off.
Did you,
Rick.
would you recommend, I missed, I don't know if you got some, but the teacher was gonna try to present some of the same stuff, what are some tips?
I would definitely do it in class and to kind of have control, because I know that that was the biggest issue for my students, not being able to explain themselves. So really structuring it to where we work on like a couple problems in class. This is like informing those explanations and giving them feedback in class and even written feedback, and then kind of like easing them into it, not saying just do this, let's see what happens. So I think that was the biggest change I would make.